letter from Jaguar in which they were threatening to cut off all their advertising. Literally, when you're driving down the freeway at 60 miles an hour, I mean, it's like you're at an idle speed. It's like 1,000 or 1,200 RPM. It's all it is. And it's giving you 25 or 30 miles per gallon. And, I mean, it's clean. It's not giving you any emissions. And it's all because of what we've been able to do with that microchip. Last year, I was locked down in Australia for 6 months. I sat down one day and said, you know what? Road and Track, as a magazine, has lived through the major significant events that have taken place in the auto industry over the last 70, 80 years. What was called the Woodward Garage, which essentially was a small, nondescript building on Woodward Avenue, but off the main campus in Highland Park. And being off the main campus meant that nobody except the people working there knew what was going on. A Dodge Dart, an A-body, got a two-barrel carburetor that actually gave it some fuel economy and that the thing would start and run. I worked on the Barracuda with the Hemis. In order to get the horsepower that they were looking for, you had to have big valves.
Well, John, you see, we made an agreement before your early onset to do a little recording here together. Jeff Stearns.
Jeff Stearns. My agent told me I was talking to Howard Stern today.
Jeff Stearns, connected through cars. If they're bigwigs, we'll have them on the show. And yes, we'll talk about cars and everything else. Here he is now, Jeff Stearns.
Now, I notice you're wearing a shirt with a logo, Road and Track.
Road and Track. Yes, indeed.
Maybe we should introduce you now on Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars, my good friend, John Dinkle. Were you 25 years? What was your role for 25 years at Road and Track?
Well, I'll back up a couple of years because I worked for Chrysler for 3 years. Two of them was when I was going through and getting that second degree. And having had one of the assignments I did was in the product planning race group. I talked about the Woodward Garage. The product planning race group was the drag racing guys. And so I was working with Tom Hoover, and Tom Hoover is the father of the Hemi engine, and Dick Maxwell, who was the marketing guy heading up all those programs, and a guy named Dave Kofel. I was working with all those guys. We had Saxon Martin, we had Dick Landy, you name it, and I was part of that group, and I spent 3 months there loving that. And when I got finished, and I was finishing up my institute assignments at the time, they said, we got an opening in this group. We want you for that job. And I said, great, I love it. As soon as I finish all my other obligations, I'm there. Well, that was 1969. And what happened to me is that Chrysler went through one of its budget cutbacks, which they did on a sort of a 3-year basis or so. And while that was happening, that job with the race group wasn't funded. So I hung out working in the current assignment that I had for as long as I possibly could until the Institute knocked on my door and said, you got a choice of A, B, or C. And none of them were jobs that I really wanted. I wound up working in the automatic transmission lab and just not having any motivation to stay. While I was at Chrysler, my second assignment after fuel systems, and at that point in time, as I said, you could look ahead and figure out what areas we're looking for engineering students and where you might be able to go. So I wanted a 3 months with the suspension lab, and I got it. And while I was there, I was called the student, and I was the student to a full-time engineer by the name of Patrick Bedard. Now, if you know that name, Patrick Bedard spent most of his life working as the technical editor of Car and Driver magazine, and then going on to becoming like an executive editor. During the time that I was there, Chrysler and Car and Driver did a trade. The guy who was the technical editor at the time was Pete Hutchinson. And Pete Hutchinson was the son of a heavyweight financial guy at Chrysler. And in fact, his grandfather was like one of the founders of Chrysler, whatever. So they were really locked in there. And in 1969 was when we were finalizing the development on the new small block motor, which was the 305 engine that was going into like the Barracuda, the Challenger, and the small Dodge Darts and the Valiants, etc. of the time. But that engine was a lot more modern and sophisticated than anything we had before. And it could compete against the 302s from GM and the same type of motor that was coming out of Ford, which were already being raced. Chrysler did a deal with Andy Granatelli to do an IndyCar using that engine. And Pete Hutchinson's father wanted him to run that program. So they talked to Car and Driver, and they found Pat Bedard. And Pat Bedard said, okay, I'll go become the technical editor of Car and Driver, and Pete Hutchinson can come back and run that program. And that's what happened. That's how Pat got into the automotive writing business. While he was there, let's go back a little further. When I was in high school, I tell people if I'd had a guidance counselor who was a little bit sharper than a dull tack, he might have said to me, hey, you and your brother, I have a twin brother, have had special math and science for 4 years. You should become engineers. So we shook our heads and said, yeah, that sounds about right. And that's what we did. We went off and became engineers.
Both you and your brother.
Right. But,
okay.
But if he had said, hey, you guys had special English for 4 years in high school, do you want to go right? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? I might have said, I don't know. I'll have to think about it. But he never did. So unlike most engineers, I never had an aversion to English and to writing. And so when Pat Bedard called me up 6 or 8 months later and said, we got an opening for a junior technical guy at Car and Driver. Are you interested? I thought to myself, yeah, I might be. So I went back there. At the time, Leon Mandel was the editor. And it was in the heyday of Trans Am racing. And they had built a car called the Blue Maxi. And that car was a duplicate of the Penske Donahue Trans Am car. Blue lettering, the whole deal. And so Leon introduces himself. He says, all right, I'm busy. Here's the keys to this car. Go run down to the Red Ball Garage, which is where all their cars were parked. He says, go take that car out and drive it and come back and we'll talk. So I took the car out for 3 or 4 hours driving it around Manhattan. Actually, I took it across onto Long Island where you could actually drive it a bit. And I came back and I wrote a bunch of notes and then went back into his office. So I started writing a litany of everything that was wrong with the car. So he stops me and says, whoa, okay, stop. So he says, what you're saying is it doesn't stop and it doesn't go. And I said, so, and yeah, in a few words, it doesn't. He says, okay. So we chatted a bit more and I went back to Detroit. And back in Detroit, I thought to myself, I'm about 2 years out of having been in New York and growing up there all my life. Went to school in Brooklyn. Now I'm going to be asked to move to the Manhattan area to try to drive cars around there for Car and Driver magazine. Do I really want to go back? And after thinking about it for a while, I just said, no, I'm not ready to go back. So I didn't. So I stayed with Chrysler.
And that's Car and Driver, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's Car and Driver, not Road and Track.
But I don't know, maybe 6 months later, I saw an ad in Competition Press Auto Week that a magazine called Car Life was looking for an engineering editor. And so I look up Car Life, and Car Life is essentially the sister publication of Road and Track. John Bond and Elaine Bond bought Road and Track for its debts. The magazine actually started in a place where I grew up. It's Long Island. So I tell people 2 great things came out of Long Island. Dan Gurney and Road and Track. So the guys who started Road and Track did 3 or 4 issues before it just started foundering. And so John and Elaine Bond, and John was the technical side, Elaine was the business side. They bought it. They moved it out to California. Car life, John loved car life more than he loved road and track. And why is that? Road and track, by the time I got there in 72, was a cash cow. They were making a ton of money with road and track because of what had happened in the car world and the growth of performance cars, sports cars, etc. But John loved car life because he had gone through GMI. He had been and worked at General Motors. And so he loved the Detroit business more than he really loved the import business. But the magazine wasn't as successful and it wasn't as big, but they were looking for an engineering editor to replace a guy who was going. In fact, it was interesting because it was a guy by the name of John McKibben. John McKibben was a Chrysler engineer who worked for I'm going to say Golden Commandos. It could have been the Ram Chargers, but it was the 2 factory racing teams that were run out of Chrysler by engineers. So they were factory, but they were all engineering guys at Chrysler who did the drag racing with the Golden Commandos and the Ram Chargers. And John McKibben was part of that. When he left, he was the engineering editor of Car Life. He got hired away by the NHTSA to do the first vehicle safety car that the DOT did. And he took what he used was he took a 1970 Chrysler C-body, which was one of the big ones with all the tumble home that they had back in those days, and they couldn't sell them until General Motors came out with similar designs the next year. And he had a facility out in the Ontario area where he was developing this car. So they needed another engineering editor, and that's how I found that note. The guy I interviewed with the then editor of Car Life magazine in Detroit, but they hired the perfect guy who was already in LA. It was a guy by the name of Dave Bean. He worked for Air Research. They were in a turbocharging company right in the business. He had a Lotus 7 that he raced, and he was a very good racer, and he was a hell of a rider. So he could have had a career in that business forever, except for one thing. And it was one thing that doomed him from a career in writing. And that one thing was deadlines. He couldn't make deadlines. So a year after they hired him, they let him go. And they came back and found me, and the then editor, Alan Girdler, hired me to become the engineering editor. And that was in 1970.
I mean, you didn't go kind on a brand if they're your advertiser, which they pretty much all were advertisers.
Well, here's what I would tell you. The best example of this would have been Dick Barkus, who was the publisher at the time, knocking on my door and saying, "Come down to my office, but I need to talk to you." And he had a letter from Jaguar in which they were threatening to cut off all their advertising because of some things we had said in the magazine about one of their cars. And I mean, I have to tell you that we tested a lot of Jaguars. I'm hard pressed to think of one that didn't have to go back to Jaguar at least once before it came back to us because of issues that we found. And normally, if we found something, we'd say, "This car isn't running right. Could you take it back and just look at it?" I wasn't going to tell them what the problem was. I wanted them to find out what it was. And if it turned out it was something that was inherent in the car, then so be it. That's what it was. But Dick, behind closed doors, was really upset that they were being pressured and that Jaguar was about to cut their advertising because of what we said. And I said to Dick, "Look, there's nothing I can do about the fact that Jaguar did such and such, and we reported on it. But I'm not writing this test for Jaguar. I'm writing this for our readers. And if we're not honest with our readers, then we have nothing to give them that would cause them to come back and read what we have to say the next time, because they'd go out and buy a specific car and find out it wasn't like what we said." And I said, "I'm not going to do that." And I said, as far as Jaguar is concerned, there's nothing I can do about what they're doing with their cars. They can do them better, obviously. But I said, there's nothing I can do about writing anything that's better for them. And they may not like what we say, but they have to respect us for having the guts to say it. And I said, if they still want to cut their advertising, they need us as much as we need them. And they're going to have to come back because they need our readers, because those are the people who are buying their cars. And that's it.
Well done.
There was that pressure occasionally, but pretty much it was hands off from the standpoint of what we wrote. I'd get calls from the East Coast. I'd get calls from Detroit when we said stuff that was legit because of what the car did. And I don't think we ever ripped anybody for what they did, but we told it like it was. And if we couldn't have been totally candid with our readers, then I wouldn't have been doing the job I was put in place to do, and I would have just gone and done something else.
Let's talk about the Road and Track History Project, John.
Glad you asked. So what is that? Well, last year I was locked down in Australia for 6 months, and when you think about that, you might say, "Oh my God, that's just terrible," but it wasn't. It turned out to be a great experience. And why is that? I have family living over there outside Sydney, and my son and daughter-in-law had their first kid, and we got over there in January. She was 8 months old at the time, and the plan was to stay for about 6 weeks, and in early February, we were going down to Melbourne for the Grand Prix. So COVID was starting to raise its ugly head at that time, and we had made flight arrangements. I had bought tickets for the race, or was going to do all of that. I was talking to people at Pirelli because I've got great contacts with them over there in Europe, and they were building all the tires. And I was talking to people in the racing organizations to find out, is the race on? So from Pirelli's perspective, not an issue. The tires weren't coming out of Italy, and Italy was pretty much closed down at the time. The racing tires were coming out of Germany, and they had shipped them. They said, we've shipped the tires. The teams are going. Nothing's going to happen. So ultimately, my wife and I flew down there on Thursday. So we get in, and we get out to the Airbnb where we're staying. And it was perfect. It was right across the street from the track. And the gate that we had to go in was right there. And so Thursday afternoon, we spent at the track just getting familiar with the surroundings and whatnot. And they ran some of the Porsche Cup stuff and a few other things. Not that the F1 cars, no, they weren't going to come out until first thing Friday morning. So we went back, had dinner, and then planned, hey, let's go down to Kohl's. Now, Kohl's is like a Trader Joe's. Upscale, sort of a supermarket, smaller size, and we're going to go get some sandwiches and stuff to take to the track the next day. So at 8 o'clock the next day, Friday, we're walking over to the track, and I said to my wife, "What do you hear?" And she said, "Nothing." And so I turned to her and said, "The race has been canceled." And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You don't hear anything. There's no cars on the track. Something's happened. They ain't running." By the time we got to Kohl's, they had the newspapers out, race canceled. So that was the end of it. So we got back to Sydney. We flew back to Sydney on Saturday rather than waiting for another couple of days, which we had at the Airbnb, because we didn't know what the hell was going to happen. And by Saturday night, they had closed down all the states. You couldn't move from state to state. You couldn't come in or leave Australia. You were locked down completely. So we had gotten back. My son and daughter had a house, part of a house that they had. It was a flat, and they had an extra bedroom. So we took up residence in that bedroom for the next four plus months that we were there. And I had my Mac computer, I had my iPhone, and the only difference for me as far as working was I was dealing with different time zones, and I do that in any case. So it didn't matter whether I needed to call somebody in Malta or somebody in China or Japan. It all worked out fine. And we got to be there for the kid's first birthday and see it for a couple more months before we came back. So it wasn't that bad.
How was day-to-day life during that time? And when you say locked down, was it like stuck in the house, didn't see anyone else? Or was it like here in Florida where we still had restaurants? Like, how was it?
It was the polar opposite. I mean, when you talk about the differences between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, Australia was locked down. And for example, they for about 3 days, they shut off they said all the beaches are closed. And then they thought to themselves, well, wait a minute. If you're in the water and you're swimming or you're surfing, I mean, you're social distancing pretty much. So let's not do that. And I mean, being at the beach is what Australians live for. I mean, they're down there all the time. So they opened the beaches back up, but they said 2 meters as far as social distancing. My son and daughter live in the Manly area, which is a fast ferry ride across from Sydney. And they lived about 7 minutes from the beach. And so all around the Manly beaches, they had paths: biking, hiking, walking, jogging, push a baby carriage. They didn't care. As long as you were moving and you were social distancing, fine. Be out with your family, walking, doing all those things, but just keep your distance. They didn't want you sitting on the walls or sitting on the beach. But no, there were some people who wore masks. I never wore a mask until the week before we left, because I turned to Leslie and said, just to be sure the airlines don't want it, well, let's go get tested. So we got tested. It took about 15 minutes to get it done, as opposed to 5 days of what it was happening over here in America, which was all frenetic at the time. And every state, every governor, every mayor was doing something different, and nobody knew what was happening at the top either. There was a lot more order to what was going on in Australia. So, as I said, we had the kid out every day. We would push her around in the carriage, go downtown, buy groceries, walk around by the beach, come back. I mean, it was sort of a normal existence, and we had a great time while we were there. And I got all the work they needed to get done. But during that time, which goes back to the Road and Track History Project, I sat down one day and said, you know what? Road and Track, as a magazine, has lived through the major significant events that have taken place in the auto industry over the last 70, 80 years, from the 40s into the 2020s. And nobody has ever put all that together. And I said, Road and Track was in the forefront of that in so many different ways. We should do something. And so it got me thinking about, what could we do? So I sat down and I put together an Excel spreadsheet. And I said, I got to think about the people who somehow touched Road and Track in some ways. And it wasn't just the staff, and it wasn't just contributors, but it was photographers, it was advertising people, it was people at the manufacturers, the marketing, you name it, anybody, even readers, who were somehow connected with the magazine for whatever reason. And I made a list, and within 2 days, I had 300 people that I had put down as just people who I'd want to connect with if I was going to do something. And I brought that list back with me. And when I got back, I started calling some of these people, like Ron Wakefield, who was the editor when I was there. And then he spent time over with Road and Track as the editor over in Europe for us. And so I just reconnected with a bunch of people and said, I'm putting together a 501c3, which will essentially give me the capability of getting people and some funding in order to do this. And I want this to be something that could be looked at not just as a body of work that would be a book. It could be 4 books. It could be more books. It could be videos. I look at it as being education modules that could teach the history of the automobile for kids who are in junior high school, and in college. And so that's one of the major projects that I'm working on right now. And I'm lining up people to be a board of advisors. And I've already got people like Ron Wakefield working on the history of the magazine from there.
That's beautiful.
So
that's worthwhile.
Who the hell are you?
Well, John, you see, we made an agreement before your early onset to do a little recording here together. Jeff Stearns.
Jeff Stearns. My agent told me I was talking to Howard Stern today. What do you do?
Or you wouldn't have shown.
Wait. I'm going to have to get a hold of my agent. Hey, Leslie, fire Art Bell. Get me that other guy, George Norrie, whoever that other guy is. This thing doesn't work at all. All right, go ahead. What?
Very small potatoes. I only have about half the audience of Howard Stern.
Well, which half do you have? The good half or the bad half?
Gotta be good.
Gotta
be good. So U of M hat. And you know, by the way, do you know what kept me out of U of M?
Yeah, probably your grades.
High school. Thank you.
It's good. Well, I have the distinction of going there twice. I went there twice because I didn't get it right the first time. But the reality is, I started my education at Bricklin Polytech in New York. It was a very good engineering school, but it was an 8-story concrete campus in the middle of Brooklyn. And I rode the Long Island Railroad every day to get there. And between my junior and my senior years, I was running up and down the stairs trying to get to another class, and I saw this ad on the wall for Ford Motor Company looking for summer students for the year. So I grabbed the telephone number and the other information, and I wrote to them, and they hired me. So the next thing I know, I'm driving my Triumph Spitfire, which had never been further away from Long Island than Lime Rock, Connecticut. I'm driving across Pennsylvania to Dearborn. So when I get to
Dearborn?
Dearborn, yeah, if you're a native of Detroit, they call it Dearborn.
Got it, but it has a little Long Island in it too.
Well, that could be a part of it also. But so anyway, I get to the HR office and the guy says, "All right, where are you going to stay?" And I said, "Hey, I'm here at your office. Never been further west than the middle of Pennsylvania, and I'm supposed to know where I'm staying when I get out here." So he took pity on me, and he called up a couple of guys who happened to have a place in Ypsilanti. Now, if you know where Ypsi is?
I'm familiar with Ypsilanti. Yeah.
Okay, so it's for those of your listeners and viewers who aren't familiar. It's about.
It's an international crowd, so they may not all know Ypsilanti.
It's about probably 40 miles west of Detroit. It's right down I-94, essentially. In any case, right on the border of Eastern Michigan University, there was a house, and we call it the West Cross Dump. It was actually moved from someplace else, where I don't know, but it was sited oddly, so that the front door really wasn't on the street. It was sort of on the side. In any case, there were 4 guys living there, one of whom was a graduate student at the U of M, working at Ford, and the other 3 were also students and working part-time with Ford, and then going to school part-time as well. So they took pity on me, they took me in, and so I spent the summer there. And the friend who was going to the University of Michigan at that time was a grad student, and he grabbed me one late afternoon and says, "Hey, let's go over to the campus. I got to get some work done." So we drive over there, and I just fell in love with the campus. I mean, if you can visualize Brooklyn, an 8-story building surrounded by concrete, and then you think of Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan campus, I mean, it was a no-brainer. So I wound up spending time at the university, just hanging out there during the summer several times. And as the summer was winding down and fall was creeping in, I just said to myself, I ain't going back. And so I went into the engineering office and I said, "Hey, I want to transfer to the school." They said, "Well, okay, send us the transcript." So I sent them the transcript, and the next thing you know, I'm now a senior in the mechanical engineering program at the University of Michigan. So that put me through for my first degree with an MS, with a BS in mechanical engineering. And because of the connections I had made with Ford over the summer, I also knew some Chrysler people as well. And they had suggested you ought to apply to Chrysler for their Chrysler Institute program. And that was a work-study program where if you got into it, they put you back to school right away for an advanced degree. And you went to school 2 days a week. In this case, they were putting you to school at the University of Michigan on the Dearborn campus, which was fairly new at the time. So I got my MS in mechanical engineering over 2 years with Chrysler. And I went to school 2 days a week. I worked 3 days a week. Every 3 months, I changed work assignments. And I mean, that may have been the best part of the deal, because if you were really clever with how you planned out what you wanted to do, you could do some great things. So, for example, the Chrysler Proving Grounds out in Chelsea was about 70 or 80 miles west of Highland Park, where I was living at the time. And so thinking about an assignment at the Proving Grounds in Chelsea in the winter was sort of like, that doesn't sound like what I want to do. So I did that for a summer term with one of my other roommates, so we could drive out together. I had 2 assignments with the racing groups. One was what was called the Woodward Garage, which essentially was a small nondescript building on Woodward Avenue, but off the main campus in Highland Park. And being off the main campus meant that nobody except the people working there knew what was going on. But even better was the following. The first day I got to Chrysler, they had assigned me to fuel systems. So I'm in the fuel systems lab, which at that time really was mostly carburation. And it was at the very early days of anything to do with fuel economy, fuel emissions, etc. All that stuff was just really in its infancy at the time.
So what was it? Performance?
No, it was just a carburetor lab. So it was.
Right, but if we're not worrying about efficiency or emissions, what are we worrying about?
Well, we're worrying about making sure that a Dodge Dart, an A body, got a 2-barrel carburetor that actually gave it some fuel economy, and that the thing would start and run when you wanted it to. So we were in charge of doing all of the development work on the manifolding and on the carburation for all the models that they did, essentially. But the first day I'm there, they're taking me around and showing me the lab, and I get this. Somebody's knocking on my shoulder. And I was talking with somebody else, so I didn't look right away. And so all of a sudden, the knock gets a little harder. And the guy says, "Excuse me." So I turn around, and he says, "Put down that wrench." I mean, I had been holding a wrench in my hand because there was one sitting on the table there. I was just using it as a pointer. So I look at the other engineers here, and they're sort of smirking at me. And the guy says, "If you don't put down that wrench, I'm going to have to write a grievance." So I put the wrench down, and they tell me, "Hey, this guy is the head of the shop, and he's the only guy. The mechanics are the only people who are allowed to pick up tools. So I'm an engineer. I can tell him what I want him to do, pick up this wrench, turn this nut 3 degrees, and then put it back down again, but I couldn't do that myself." So that was all because of the UAW unionization within the Highland Park complex. Out in the Woodward Garage, all bets are off. I mean, the goal for the people who were working out there was one. We want to win races. So the mechanics and the engineers all worked together. If I was doing a mechanic's job, that was okay. The other guy who was a mechanic might have been doing something an engineer would normally do. It was good. So that was one of the great three months assignments I had. During that time, I worked on the Barracuda. It would have been the 1970 Barracuda, which was the F-Series E-body, as they would have called it. As an E-body was the Barracuda, and it was the first of the new generation. And they wanted to go Trans Am racing with that body, so we did the initial development work on that chassis and on that car, and then took it to Mid Ohio for the initial testing. So I worked on that, and I also did some work in NASCAR. And one of the projects at that time, we had the winged supercars. So the Daytona with the big swoopy nose and with the big wing at the back. I had a project to see if we could lighten the rear of the car by taking some of the weight out of the wing. And so what we did is I worked with a company that was a specialist in foamed composites, and we took the basic center section of the wing and used aluminum and then put as dense of a foam as we could into it, and then we bolted it back to the uprights that we had. And then in those days, all of the engineering for the Chrysler racing teams from NASCAR were really done by the Woodward Garage. So after the season was over, they'd send a couple of the teams up, like Harry Hyde would come up with one of his race trailers with a couple of the cars. and we would have worked on the new updated components that we would want to put on the car, both from the standpoint of powertrain, transmission, gearboxes, you name it. And we do it right there in the shop, and then they tool out to the proving grounds where they had a 5 mile oval, and they could run out there without other traffic out there and test all that stuff out. Once the stuff had been proven, they would come back and we'd give them all the components, and then they would go back down to North Carolina or wherever, and they would share that all those components with the other teams. So it wasn't until probably 10 years or so later that the teams actually started doing any of their engineering down where they were located. And that was really because one of the engineers who was working in the Woodward Garage left and took a job with one of the teams down there, and he became the liaison between Chrysler and the teams down south, and that's how the whole thing grew up down there. It turned out that the downforce on that wing was so high that regardless of how much foam and how dense that foam was, the wing did this, boom. It was going down from the amount of. So
if you're listening on audio, John is showing us that the top center of the wing is flexing down from the weight, from the downforce. Down.
And we had to go back to the really heavier, stronger piece to use in racing because it just wouldn't hold up.
So, I mean, silly question. We couldn't adjust the angle or the shape of the wing to adjust the downforce, or did you need all that downforce so you just needed a more rigid material?
Well, the wing as it came on the cars back then was not adjustable, and NASCAR wasn't about to let you do that. But it wouldn't have mattered the wing was fairly much in a level plane. If you had put any kind of an angle into it, it would have been even more downforce, and it would have been even worse as far as keeping its integrity with the air pushing down on it. So we went back to the stock wing, and it worked fine. I had another little trick project that I worked on while I was there. All the NASCAR cars, when they came off the track, they made you run over some kind of a little block. And I don't know whether it was a half an inch, an inch, 2 inches, but it was designed such that you had to have a specific amount of ground clearance while you were racing on the track. Because they didn't want people cheating. Okay, so I worked on a system. It was a hydraulic leveling system that we put into the frame rails of the car, and it had a little lever that that could be hidden down where the gear shift level was, and so that when the car was out in the track, you lowered it down, and when you came in, and you better remember to do this. You had to raise it back up so it would go over that block, and everything was copacetic. So if there's no specific rule about that you cannot use hydraulics to clear the block, does that make it legal? The answer, Jeff, is no way in hell. No, you could not do anything that would physically cause the car to be lower on the track than the specific ride height that NASCAR wanted. People don't realize today that all of the bodies in NASCAR, whether you're running a Camaro or if you're running a Ford Mustang or if you're running a Toyota Camry, all those bodies are identical. The only thing that's different is the decals they use for the headlights, essentially, and what they put around the grill.
Headlights and grill, yeah.
But back in the old days, when I was there, they had these metal templates, and they put the templates across the top of the car, across the roof, and measured all the way along from the front of the hood all the way back across the car, and along on the rear deck as well. And then they longitudinally had these same sorts of structures that they would put along the length of the car to make sure that you were lowering the roof or the hood or anything else, so it conformed to the configuration that NASCAR should have said it had to. And if you were fooling around with it in some fashion, they would know, because the forms that they were using to measure the car would show differentials. Now it's all done with computers and lasers, and you can be off 1 nanomillimeter and they'll know.
But back then, I mean, you're telling me they're measuring across and measuring longitudinally, but it was still the real car body.
Well, it was a stock car. I mean, that.
And then they homologated it so they could race it.
Back in those days, they were the stock cars. And essentially, you had to race what you were selling on the street. So when Ford came out initially with that long Talladega nose that they had on the Torinos, they snookered Chrysler for about a half a year because all of a sudden Chrysler figured out that, I mean, they were picking up 10, 20 miles an hour on top end because of the aerodynamics and the less drag on the nose of that car. So that's why they came out with the wing and with the wedgy noses that they put on both the Dodge and the Plymouth versions, because they needed to get back that unfair advantage. And they had to be able to sell those cars in order to be able to race them. So today it's an all different story today, and really the only difference in those cars for the most part is the motors. I mean, you got a Toyota motor, you got a Chevy motor, or you got a Ford motor. And that's
right, but it's not even related to a stock car.
Well,
a Ford motor, Chevy motor.
No, they're purely racing motors. And back then, that Hemi, was a built up street Hemi, and you could put some heavy duty components in it. But essentially, it was the same engine that they were selling in the cars that you would go down to your local dealer to buy.
Do you know Marty Schorr?
Marty Schorr, is he from the East Shore or the West Shore or Bay Shore? Yeah, I know Marty Schorr. Sure. Marty
Schorr, of course, from New York, Cars Magazine.
But he's down in Florida now, right? He's down by you now.
He's Sarasota, yeah.
Yeah. And his kid is the PR guy for Aston Martin, I think.
That's right.
Or Land Rover. One of the two.
But Marty said that the Hemi, and you may not know this because you were working on racing, but out of the showroom really didn't run well.
Well,
wide open throttle, sure, but trying to idle and normal drivability or no modifications, not great.
I can't argue with you, because if you think about what you had to do back in those days to get the performance that they got out of those engines, it was 426 cubic inches and 425 horsepower. And when you lit up a Hemi, just a conventional street Hemi, I mean, it had overlap on the cam that was like blah, 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 blah. That thing didn't want to idle. No, it didn't. It was an engine that was, 4,500 to $7,000 is where its sweet spot was. And so you had to idle it around town in order to have the chance to run it at those higher RPMs when you had a chance. And again, the rules would limit what way you could do. And the fact is, with a couple of 4-barrel carburetors throwing out a ton of fuel, those things didn't want to idle, and they didn't even want to start. And when you started having to put emission type controls onto the things, it got even worse. I mean, I would tell you that, I got into the writing side of the business starting in 1970 with Car Life magazine. And from then until the mid 80s, the first word out of your mouth on any road test would be the word drivability. And you'd say there wasn't any. You couldn't get them to start, run, idle. They would stall. I mean, it was just the nature of the beast, even for a conventional engine back in those days, because they were so choked down because of having to meet emissions and fuel economy. And this is just the emission side. But if you bought a 1975 Corvette 350 cubic inch motor back in the mid 70s, that 350 cubic inch motor was putting out about 125 horsepower.
But they were, they sound good, felt good. They gave you the visceral experience. My dad had a lot of those Corvettes.
Well, any of those big motors on the street, you could make them run, but with all the carburation they had, they were not the type of an engine that you just sat at a street light and said, "Gee, this is the best thing in my life." You had to get them and get them up into the RPM range where they could actually start using the fuel and the overlap in the cams, etc., to get to the type of horsepower that they were they were doing.
Are you able to explain? I mean, I can imagine when you say cam overlap, I can imagine that idle, which is, of course, the idle sound that I always want in any powerful car. But can you explain to the audience what cam overlap is?
Well, let's start from the beginnings. And with the Hemis, in order to get the horsepower that they were looking for, you had to have big valves. And so you had you had to. I owned a Triumph Spitfire at the time, and you could have fit 4 of the Triumph Spitfire intake valves in the area that was consumed by 1 Hemi intake valve, almost. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they had to have huge amount of valve opening to get enough fuel and air into the engine to begin with. Okay, that's number one. And so then you're faced with the problem of getting all that stuff to mix, all right? And the more the valve's opening, the harder it is to get all that stuff through there and to get it to mix properly as well. So that's the next issue. Then when I talk about the camshaft, you want to keep those valves open for as long as possible. So you have really steep profiles on the cam, opening the valves early, shutting them late, and just to get the horsepower into those engines. And so all of that is not good for what you would call overall smooth drivability of an engine. And that's what you were dealing with. And you had big 4-barrel carburetors, and you didn't have great control over them. When you opened those secondaries, it dumped a ton of fuel into that manifold. And then you were charged with having to get that air and that fuel mixed in such a way that you could get it into the cylinders and mixed and burned and making the horsepower. So the cams, because of the type of openings and closings you had, I go back to what I said. The overlap made it idle very roughly, and it was trying to burn efficiently at a time when it was opening too much and closing too late. But when the engine started pulling up RPMs, then you needed to have those valves opening because the timing was the same for how long it took to open and close because of the cam profile. You couldn't vary that. So at higher RPMs, you had a lot less time, really, for the air and the fuel to get in. So you just had to compromise the lower end performance of those engines to make them run well at the top end. And I mean, if you raced a Hemi, you probably would have put a different cam in that was even more extreme, which you would have gotten out of the factory.
Right. So it would even be more of a drivability problem or more of an idling problem, et cetera. But the idea for the audience is with a cam, I mean, if you're interested in this little piece about cams, is that we can gear a cam for very smooth idle, very efficient, or heavier acceleration, heavier torque. Nowadays, they have things like a variable rate cam where it's actually turning and adjusting so that it can idle and not run out of breath at the top of RPM either. Did I word that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And even more than that, I like to ask people the question, what are the biggest innovations in automobile engineering over the last 50 or 100 years? And you get all sorts of things. And I'll ask, what are the 2 biggest advances that we've seen?
I'm going to go with disc brakes.
Okay.
And I'm going to go with, as of late, but of course we're leaving gasoline, I'm going to go with all the gears in a transmission now available.
And I would tell you, you're close, but there ain't no cigar for you today.
I knew I was in danger with you.
No, actually, disc brakes were a significant improvement over what we had in braking. But I would tell you that even more important than what the brakes did is tires. If you can imagine the tires that we run on today, 20 or 30 years ago, they would have been racing tires.
Right.
And when I got into the business, American tire manufacturers were doing nothing but bias-ply tires. You had to go to Europe to find radial tires. Now, that said, the bias-ply tires that were on American cars, if you were an enthusiast, they were terrible. They really were terrible. They were balloon tires. Back in those days, we had an 80 profile tire, which meant that the distance between where the rim was and how much rubber went from there down to the road was big. So you had a large envelope in which you put air. Air can be compressed, but you can only put certain PSI into the tires. So the bias-ply tires were just soft and squishy and didn't grip very well. And really, for American drivers driving on American roads, the emphasis really was on going straight ahead down a highway and with the smoothest possible ride you could have. So handling really wasn't a part of the equation back then. So not many people cared, except for you and I who were enthusiasts and didn't like the fact that these cars didn't turn, didn't stop, didn't go really, and the tires were a big part of that equation. I did with Ron Wakefield the very first tire test that anybody in America ever did. We did it with Road and Track back in 1972. And we borrowed a 240Z from Datsun, and we arranged to get about maybe 15 different sets of tires. Radial tires is what we were after. That was what we went for, and those tires became the very first tire test ever done by an American magazine.
Now, what was your role with Road and Track at this time?
I joined in Road and Track in 1972, and I was the engineering editor. Jim Crow, who was the editor at the time, was in love with Baja, and he loved taking his Jeep Grand Cherokee, down to Baja and spend time down there. And from that traveling to Baja, which he did, he came up with the concept for what became the very first magazine dealing with pickup trucks. It was called PV4, Pickup Van and Four-Wheel Drive. And it was the very first magazine of that type. And when Jim convinced the Bonds that they needed to do a magazine in that field because of what was happening in that field at the time, he went off to do that. So when he went off and he did it at a building a couple blocks away from headquarters, Ron Wakefield, who was the engineering editor at the time, moved up to become editor, and he came looking for me, and he found me, and I became the engineering editor. So we collectively thought up the issue of we need to do tire testing here because it's something that our readers need to know about. And so we had Pirelli and Michelin, and we had some early types of other bias belted tires, etc., that we tested as well. But the reality is that the European tires ran away with the results, whether it was straight line traction, whether it was traction in the wet, whether it was cornering, braking, you name it. The radial tire was just a much more superior tire than anything we had. The problem in America at that time is that there were two different types of molds. You had a clamp-shaped mold. So think about two halves of a shell, of a clamshell going together. And that was the technology that was used for making a bias-ply tire. A European tire required segmented molds. So they had to have pieces that that sort of laid down all around the tire. And you couldn't build radial tire on what would be a clamshell mold. So it would have meant huge investments by the tire companies to go to radials. I mean, ultimately they did. But what we saw happening was sort of a bias belted tire. they could use the clamshell mold, and they could still put belts to help stabilize the tire, somewhat like a Radial, but not anywhere as good, by using these belts. And you could use the same clamshell molds. So that was the first evolution from the Detroit industry, from Bias-ply tires to the bias-belted tires. I can tell you, I got some of the earliest bias-belted tires that Chrysler was getting from Goodyear to put on a Barracuda that I had. I had a 66 Barracuda Formula S, much better tire than what they had. But the problem was that within about 2 weeks, every one of those tires had bulges in the sidewalls, and they had to be replaced. So that technology wasn't, I mean, it's like any other new technology. It took a lot more development than they probably thought. And maybe some of us were driving harder than they expected people to drive.
So what about innovation number 2 in automotive?
So small that you could overlook it very easily. But it's the thing you find in any device like this these days. It's the microchip. When you and I were growing up in the heyday of muscle cars, I mean, there's never been anything before or after that's had the performance and the capabilities of cars that came from the middle 60s into the very early 70s.
Right.
What did I just say? Did I say that you can't buy a Corvette today that has 700 horsepower, has 25 miles per gallon and 60 miles an hour on the freeway, and is as clean as a whistle? Huh?
Well, I mean, really, if you think about 0 to 60 times, many cars can blow away the muscle cars of those era. I mean, and God forbid the electrics.
Well, they blow them away in every single way you can think of. Whether it's
right, they stop and turn too. Yeah, top
end, quarter mile. There's nothing like performance, and it's all because of the microchip. The microchip gave us back horsepower. It gave us fuel economy like you can't believe, and it gave us engines so clean that you can't measure the emissions. I mean, a Chevy Corvette with 650 horsepower that you can buy for $60,000, the best performance value on the planet or off the planet these days, from the performance perspective. Literally, when you're driving down the freeway at 60 miles an hour, I mean, it's like you're at an idle speed. It's like 1,000 or 1,200 RPM. It's all it is, and it's giving you 25 or 30 miles per gallon. And I mean, it's clean. It's not giving you any emissions, and it's all because of what we've been able to do with that microchip. I mean, it's just amazing. If we hadn't developed the microchip, if you can remember back in the 80s when Lee Iacocca went over to Chrysler, everything was evolving down to 4 cylinders and to 4-cylinder turbos, and he was going to be doing 3-cylinder motors as well, and that was the future. We had nothing else on the horizon that was going to give us back anything in the way of performance and economy and emissions that we needed, except downsizing engines to nothing. I mean, I can remember getting a press kit from General Motors at the time, and this press kit had talked about the GM engine family of the future. It started with a V8, and they had cut 2 cylinders off, so it was a 90-degree V6. That would be a downsized V8, so it's going to be a V6. And then they had cut 2 more cylinders off, so it was a 90-degree V4. Okay, so they'd done that. And then they had a V3 with 2 cylinders in one bank and one in the other. And back in the day, Dottie from Denon, bless her soul, passed away recently. On the door jamb of her office at Road and Track, we had the history of Road and Track on the wall in pencil. Every time something came up that somebody thought was relevant, they would just take a pencil and they'd write it there. So the jaw jam for about 4 to 5 feet had all these little sayings with dates on them as far as what was going on. And one of the things I had put down was no way on GM V3. And we had this press kit in the library, and if it wasn't for the fact that the library is now in New York or in Ann Arbor, I'm not sure where, I could walk in there and I could pull it out and say, see, here it is. They were going to do a 3-cylinder. I bet you couldn't talk to anybody at GM today who would have the memory or would want to remember that they were going to do a V3 back in the day. And sadly, I mean, occasionally the CBS people would have the building painted. And the day we found out it was going to be painted, I went to the top people and said, hey, you cannot paint this door jamb on Dottie's office. If they're going to do that, I'm going to go take pictures of everything that's on it right now so we don't lose it. And they swore up and down, nothing will ever happen to this door. It will not be a problem. When I came in the following Monday, it was gone. And there's no way you could recreate it because a lot of it was just pencil. That's
horrible. That's a horrible story, really.
And there were so many clever things that were said there that really were sound bites of history that disappeared.
That's really pathetic. Terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you able to explain what the difference is? I understand the mold, but what is the difference in the idea of a Bias-ply and a radial?
It would be easier if we had pictures, but essentially, the radial tire is built in such a way in which it has belts running underneath the tread, and they're sort of interlaced in such a way that they provide stiffness and support for the tread. But you also notice that a radial tire typically has a profile that looks like it needs air.
Right. I mean, bulges, yeah.
It looks like the sidewalls are softer. But that profile was actually a whole lot better than something with stiff sidewalls, because when you were trying to corner, the tire would just sort of pick up, and you would not keep the tread on the road if you were trying to corner with it. The radial tire had much better capability of keeping the tread on the road and a wider tire patch than you could with a Bias-ply tire. So that alone.
And how? Okay, so the radial tire, simplified, the belts are running like from bead to bead across the tire and progressively around the tire.
But not necessarily. But they'd be angled across the bead as well for different characteristics. So yeah, they would be stiffening it around the circumference of the tire. But then you might have a belt like that going from sidewall to sidewall. But then you would put other belts in at specific angles that would give you specific advantages in cornering and other characteristics that you were trying to design into the tire. Right.
Okay, and then what's the distinction between that and a Bias-ply belt? How did the Bias-ply belt run?
Well, the bias belted tires, well, because of the fact that they were using the clamshell mold, they were putting belts in, but they weren't anywhere near as efficiently being used as you could with a segmented mold that allowed you to build the tire very differently. And that was the big difference. It's one of the things I work with today is companies that do disruptive technologies. And the only engine that has come into the automotive field really in the last 100 years that's different than what we have running up and down with pistons is what Mazda did.
With the rotary.
When they were the company to develop a rotary engine, it's the only engine besides the piston engine that we've had in a hell of a long time. We tried, Chrysler tried a turbine. I mean, we tried a few other things. I mean, back in the old days, the early development of the gasoline or of the automobile, you had electric cars, you had steam engines, and you had gasoline. You know why gasoline won out?
Money.
Ultimately, it became money. But back in the day, we were pulling oil out of the ground, and we were using it to oil all the gears of machinery and whatnot. And
well, I mean, they were using whale oil for oiling gears in street lights.
So there was a byproduct of this oil that was coming out of the ground. You know what it was? It was this liquid called gasoline. and nobody knew what the hell to do with the stuff. It was worthless. But you got it with the crude oil that you wanted to use for other things.
See, I always thought a refinery took crude oil and made it into gasoline. I didn't realize gasoline was one of the compounds coming out of the ground with crude oil.
That's exactly what it was. It was a byproduct. When people discovered that you could make an engine and you could run it on this crude stuff called gasoline because you could ignite it and it would burn. There was a guy named John D. Rockefeller who was heavily into the oil industry at the time. And he did two things. He put a lot of support into the development of gasoline-powered engines. But even more than that is he built service stations. So, I mean, as America was developing and cars were developing, you could only go a certain distance. If you had an electric vehicle, you could only go a certain distance before the batteries ran out. And if you had a steam engine, well, you'd have to stop and find water so you could fill up the boiler again and get that hot and start going again. Gasoline had some real advantages compared to the other types of fuel. But it still had the same disadvantages. You drove 50 miles or 100 miles and you ran out of gas. Where the hell are you going to get more gas? So John D. Rockefeller built the first service stations, gas stations, along various routes going out of major cities so that when you were running low, you could stop and fill up. So he made tons of money by selling a waste product that nobody else wanted called gasoline to run on engines. And that really was the thing that pushed gasoline-powered engines to the forefront of development.
So, John, Rockefeller puts these service stations on main roads going out of major metros so that people could fill up. Before Rockefeller service stations, where were people getting fuel? Just a local service station, or was it like some kind of craft business where people would go and get some gasoline?
It would have to have been something very local. And just realize back then that we were very early in the development of, one-cylinder engines and whatnot. And so you didn't have gasoline available very many places. It just wasn't that available initially. And the fact is, an electric vehicle was more expensive than the gasoline engines of an equivalent time. But women, 100 to 1, gravitated to electric vehicles, because they weren't dirty and sooty like the gasoline engines were. And the biggest issue was you didn't have to crank it. And having to crank a gasoline engine really was the death knell for most women being able to drive. A woman could get behind the wheel of an EV and click, you were off. But the electric vehicles were typically more expensive than their gasoline counterparts. And it wasn't until Kettering came along with the electric starter that we were able to really put women behind the wheel. And that Kettering and Kettering Institute, Kettering Lab, that was all what became part of what was part of GM. And Kettering was the guy who invented the electric starter.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that was a plus or a minus. I think then they wanted to vote. I mean, they were starting to feel some freedom, so I don't know. Something that we don't know about you.
I mentioned I'm a twin. Then a lot of people don't know that. When I tell them that, they think it's a pun, but it's not. But I am a twin. He looks a lot like me, not as much today as he did way back when, but he has a mustache, so you can tell us apart. But the biggest difference is I'm left-handed and he's right-handed.
Oh, no kidding.
And so he stayed in engineering all his life, and I have a conflicted brain because most engineers are right-handed, I think, with the left side of the brain, which is the calculating side for engineering. And so I'm conflicted by being left-handed and thinking with the right side, and that's where all my puns come from. But using both of those sides to do what I've done for pretty much all my life.
How do you know which one you are?
At any given time?
Yeah.
I think you'd have to ask my wife. I couldn't tell you.
What about something that you'd like us to know about you?
Something I'd like you to know about me? Well, here's something you don't know about me. I grew up in Yankee Stadium. And when I say grew up in Yankee Stadium, it wasn't that I was a Yankee fan, but literally, I grew up in Yankee Stadium. And so how does that happen? Well, I grew up in Queens. My father worked for a company called Con Edison. And he started at Con Edison when he was 14. And he was a Boy Scout and he could be a messenger. And he spent his life working at Con Edison. And in order to support the family, and we had 4 kids total, he had a second job. And on nights and on weekends, he worked at Yankee Stadium and sometimes at the Polo Grounds as an usher. And to take me and my brother out of my mother's hair for some of the weekends and things, he would take us up to Yankee Stadium very early, and we would stay very late because that's what the ushers had to do. And he'd sit us in any empty seat, and if it got filled by somebody who had a ticket, we just moved to some other seat. We spent a lot of time up in the old Yankee Stadium, and I know more about that stadium and the inner workings and the bowels of that stadium like most people never would. And when you think about the sorts of clubhouses that exist today, back in those days, I mean, you were underground. It was hot. Well, it was cool, damp, wet, dirty, dusty, dark. It was not a fun place to be, but that's where you hung out before you came out.
So you were the guy to consult if somebody wanted to plan a robbery.
I wouldn't say that. No, not at least not in current company.
At least not a current company.
And the bad part of that was I lived in a very Bricklin Dodger part of Queens, so I was an outcast because I was a Yankee fan. But I didn't care. The Yankees were my team, and I say my team BS. That was before Steinbrenner, and if you remember, I mean, for a good part of the time that I was at Road and Track, it was owned by CBS, and CBS had gotten into an acquisition stage of its life, and so they were buying up all sorts of multimedia stuff, and among them, they bought the Yankees and sort of destroyed that franchise. And I think when they started getting rid of all these acquisitions, including the magazines, Steinbrenner bought the Yankees for not more than a couple $1 million. And now you can put a B in front of what that is for what the Yankees are worth today.
Oh my gosh! And you couldn't get a player. Couldn't get a player for that. So, John, I want to thank you very much for your generosity. You've given us a lot of time tonight. I'm sure that our listeners have been intrigued by your stories that only someone with your background could tell. Plus, you're so darn articulate, and I'm sure that you had movie star looks at one time.
I still have that today. In fact, at one time, this is what something that you don't know about me. I had very large sort of horn-rimmed glasses.
Yes.
And more hair than I have today. And people would say that I looked like that rhetorical question: Woody or wouldn't he? and the Woody was Woody Allen. So,
I was putting that together, but that is so you. Thanks, honest to God, really. You're enjoyed every second with you.
This has been Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars.